The storm found me the way it always used to. Not with a warning, but with a sudden absence of quiet, like the whole house had inhaled and forgotten how to let go. I woke with my heart already pounding before my mind caught up, before I understood that the crack of thunder rolling over the bluff was the reason. Rain hit the windows in sheets, the old glass rattling in its frames the way it had rattled since before I was born. Somewhere below, a shutter banged against the siding, and the lights on my nightstand, the ones that had been humming faithfully since I moved back into my mother's old beach house, died without ceremony, plunging the room into the particular, thick darkness of a coastal blackout, where even the horizon disappears, and the only light left in the world is whatever the sky decides to give you. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house groan the way old houses do, timber settling, wind finding every gap in the siding my father had never quite finished sealing, and for a moment I let myself believe I was 11 years old again, waiting for my mother to come check on me, waiting for the storm to pass so I could go find Wren Calloway sitting on her porch steps in the rain, grinning like the sky owed her something, and had finally decided to pay up. Then I heard my bedroom door open. I sat up fast, pulse jumping, my hand already reaching for the flashlight I kept by the bed out of habit, a habit from Seattle, from nights alone in an apartment where the power flickered whenever the wind picked up off the sound. But the shape in the doorway wasn't a stranger. It was tall and soaked through, hair plastered to her jaw, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own ribs together. Lightning cracked outside and lit her up for half a second, long enough for me to see her face, and it undid something in my chest, because I had never once, in nearly 30 years of knowing her, seen Wren Calloway look afraid. "Wren?" "I know," she said, voice unsteady, barely above the rain. "I was outside, the camera cases, I had to get them off the porch before the wind took them, and then the thunder just—" She stopped, swallowed hard, a sound I could hear even over the storm. Her arms tightened around herself. "I didn't want to be alone right now. I'm sorry. I'll go." She didn't go. She stood in my doorway dripping onto the floorboards, barefoot, wearing an old t-shirt that had gone translucent with rain, and she looked so unlike the woman who'd spent the last 4 days moving through my house like she owned the air in it. Sarcastic, unbothered, infuriatingly certain of herself, the woman who'd built an entire documentary career out of standing calmly in front of collapsing weather systems, that for a second I didn't know what to do with my hands. "Come here," I said, and pulled back the blanket. She crossed the room like the floor might give way beneath her, and when she climbed into my bed I felt the cold coming off her skin, felt her shiver so hard it rattled the frame. She curled into me without asking permission, without her usual performance of confidence, and pressed her face into my shoulder, her wet hair soaking straight through the collar of my shirt. "Just hold me," she whispered. "Please, just hold me. I don't need you to say anything." So I did. I wrapped my arms around her, felt her breath come in these uneven little pulls that she was clearly trying to smooth out and couldn't. She smelled like rain and salt and, underneath that, like something achingly familiar, the same lavender soap she'd used at 17, apparently, because some things about a person never change, even when everything else does. Her hands found the front of my shirt and gripped it like she was afraid the storm might reach in through the walls and take me too. I want to tell you now, before we go any further, that this wasn't the beginning of the story. It only felt that way because I'd spent 10 years trying to convince myself the beginning didn't exist. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full no limits experience and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. Now, back to that night, and to what was actually happening in the dark of my childhood bedroom. I held her through the thunder. I held her while the wind screamed against the windows, and the old lighthouse beam 3 miles down the coast cut through the rain in long, patient sweeps, visible even through the storm, the way it had been visible from her childhood bedroom window, and mine, a slow white blade, turning through the dark like it was keeping time for the whole town. I didn't ask her what had scared her. I didn't ask why the girl who chased tornadoes for a living, who'd built an entire career out of standing in the path of violent weather with a camera in her hands, was shaking apart over a summer squall on the Oregon coast. I just held her, felt her cold feet tuck against my calves without apology, felt the goosebumps rising along her forearms, slowly smooth out under my palms, and somewhere in the middle of it, her breathing slowed, and her grip loosened, and she pressed closer instead of further away, like my heartbeat was the only steady thing left in the world. "You're freezing," I murmured into her hair. "I'll live." "That's not what I asked." She let out something that was almost a laugh, small and wrecked. "I forgot how you do that. Answer the question I didn't ask instead of the one I did. You used to do the same thing to me." "I still do it. I've just gotten better at hiding it." Her hand found mine under the blanket, fingers cold and trembling slightly, and laced through mine like it was the most natural gesture in the world, like 10 years hadn't happened, like we were still 16, and tangled together on her narrow bed listening to a different storm. "Thank you for not asking. I wasn't going to make you explain yourself in the middle of a blackout." "I know, that's kind of the whole problem, Harper. You never did." But to understand why that single, ordinary sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water, you have to understand everything that came before it. Wren Calloway and I grew up on the same half-mile of coastline, in houses that faced each other across a stretch of dune grass and driftwood, and for the first 18 years of my life, she was the loudest, brightest, most reckless thing in it. She was the girl who climbed the lighthouse fence when we were 9, because she wanted to see the ocean from higher up, and dragged me up after her, both of us shrieking with laughter and terror in equal measure, while my mother yelled at us from the road. She was the girl who dared me to jump off the rocks into the cove at midnight when we were 14, and held my hand the whole way down so I wouldn't chicken out, and afterward, dripping and freezing and alive in a way I'd never felt in daylight, she'd grinned at me and said, "See? Nothing bad happens when we're together." She used to crawl through my bedroom window during storms. Not the door, always the window. Like sneaking in made the whole thing feel more like an adventure, and less like what it actually was, which was a girl who didn't want to be alone with the thunder. We used to lie in my bed with the lights off and make up stories about all the places we'd go when we were old enough to leave. Reykjavik, Marrakesh, some invented city we called Wind Hollow that existed only in our heads, with rules only the two of us understood. And Wren always said the same thing at the end of every story. "No storm can scare us if we're together." She said it like a vow. I believed it like one. I fell in love with her so slowly I never noticed the exact moment it happened. There wasn't a single scene I could point to, no cinematic realization, just 1,000 small mornings of watching her eat cereal straight from the box, watching her fall asleep, mid-sentence on my bedroom floor with a comic book open on her chest, watching her defend me without hesitation from anyone who ever made me feel small, and thinking, with a kind of quiet, terrified clarity, that I would follow this girl anywhere. I never told her. I was 17 and then 18, and the fear of losing the only real thing I had always outweighed the ache of wanting more of it. Until the last summer, when we were both 18, and the world was about to open up and swallow us whole in different directions, her to a photography program in Colorado, me to art school in Seattle, and a storm rolled in on our last night in town, and we ran to the lighthouse the way we always had, laughing, soaked, breathless, because some habits you don't outgrow just because you're supposed to be an adult now. We stood inside that old stone tower with the rain hammering the windows, and the beam turning slow circles above our heads, and Wren looked at me in a way she had never looked at me before. She reached up and brushed a piece of wet hair off my face, and her hand stayed there, at my jaw, warm despite the cold rain on both of us, and neither of us moved, and I thought, this is it, this is the moment, and I leaned in, and she stepped back like I'd struck her. She laughed it off, said something about the wind, about how she needed to finish packing, about how her dad was probably wondering where she was. By morning she was gone, no goodbye, no note, just an empty house across the dune grass, and a silence that lasted 10 years. I spent a decade telling myself I'd imagined the whole thing, the hand at my jaw, the almost, the the promise of no storm scaring us if we were together. I built a life in Seattle around not thinking about it. I illustrated book covers for a living, mostly romance novels, which felt like a private joke the universe was playing on me, painting other women's happy endings on glossy cardstock, while mine stayed folded up in a drawer somewhere I refused to open. I dated women who were kind and interesting and entirely wrong for me, and I told myself that was just how love worked for some people. Pleasant, survivable, forgettable. I had never once, in 10 years, let myself get attached the way I'd been attached to Wren, because some part of me was still braced for the disappearing act. Then I burned out so completely that my hands started shaking every time I opened a client email, and I came home to the beach house my mother left me, intending to fix the roof and sell it and never look back. And Wren Calloway came home too, 4 days before that storm, to film a documentary about towns like ours disappearing into the sea, and the inn she'd booked flooded on her second night in town, and I offered her my spare room because my mother raised me to be decent, even when decency was inconvenient, and there we were. 4 days of walking around each other like the floor was made of glass. I woke up alone the next morning, which surprised me more than it should have. I found Wren in the kitchen, hair dry now, wearing one of my old sweatshirts, making coffee in a way that suggested she'd been standing there a while, working up the nerve to face me. There was a stillness to her that hadn't been there in 4 days of forced small talk, a rawness she hadn't quite managed to bury under her usual armor. "So," she said, not turning around, "that was a whole thing. You could say that." I was going to blame it on low blood sugar, but I think we both know that's not. She stopped, exhaled, finally turned around. There were faint shadows under her eyes, like she hadn't slept after all, just lain there pretending to, and if I looked closely, and I always did, with her, I could see the telltale redness at the rims that meant she'd been crying at some point in the small hours after the storm broke, and I'd finally drifted off holding her. I didn't say anything about it. I just filed it away, quietly, the way you'd tuck a fragile thing somewhere safe. I'm sorry for barging in like that. You don't have to apologize for being scared of thunder, Wren. I'm not scared of thunder. The old defensiveness snapped back into place so fast it almost convinced me. Almost. I chase storms for a living, Harper. I've stood 40 feet from a wall cloud with a camera in my hands, while grown men were diving for their trucks. I'm not scared of weather. Okay, I said, and let it go, because pushing Wren Calloway never worked. You had to leave the door open and wait for her to walk through it on her own schedule, a lesson I'd learned at 8 years old and apparently never unlearned. I poured myself coffee into the same chipped blue mug I'd used since childhood, the one with the faded whale on the side that Wren had given me for my 10th birthday, and I noticed her watching my hands, the paint still ground into the creases of my knuckles from the cover I'd been sketching the day before. "You still do that," she said. "The paint thing. You used to come to my house with blue fingers and act like you hadn't noticed. Occupational hazard." "I liked it," she said, quietly, and then seemed startled by her own honesty, and busied herself wiping down a counter that didn't need wiping, moving a stack of wet towels from one chair to another, with more focus than the task required. We spent that whole morning circling each other in the wreckage the storm had left behind. Wet towels draped over every chair, a tree branch through the porch screen that we'd have to deal with before it let the rain in again. The smell of ozone still hanging heavy in the salt air, and something about doing chores together, silently, competently, the way we used to when we were kids helping our parents board up windows before a hurricane, cracked something open between us that 4 days of careful politeness hadn't managed to touch. She held the ladder while I checked the roofline for missing shingles. I handed her nails while she reset the loose porch railing, and at one point our hands brushed and she went very still, and neither of us mentioned it, and both of us noticed. By the time we walked the shoreline that afternoon, boots sinking into wet sand, looking for storm-tossed sea glass out of habit neither of us had abandoned in a decade, we were talking again the way we used to. Not about anything that mattered. Not yet. Just easy things. Town gossip. The ridiculous new coffee shop that had opened where the hardware store used to be. The way old man Petrosky still yelled at kids for walking on his lawn even though his lawn was mostly weeds now. But underneath the easy things, I could feel the old current running, the one that used to pull us together without either of us trying, the one that had apparently never actually stopped, just gone quiet under a decade of distance. "There's a piece," Wren said, crouching, and held up a fragment of green glass, worn smooth by years of tide. She turned it over in her palm, sunlight catching it, and for a second, she looked exactly like she had at 12 years old, entirely unguarded, entirely herself. "I have a whole box of these somewhere. From us. Did you keep yours?" "I kept everything," I admitted, before I could stop myself. She looked up at me sharply, something flickering behind her eyes, and I turned back toward the water so she wouldn't see whatever was happening on my face. We kept walking, the wind pulling strands of hair loose from her braid, the sky still bruised purple from the storm's exit, gulls wheeling overhead in search of whatever the tide had turned up. That evening, back at the house, I made the mistake of sketching while she worked in the makeshift editing room she'd set up in my mother's old sunroom, cables and hard drives and a laptop glowing blue against stacks of photographs from her years chasing storms across 3 continents, a supercell in Kansas lit gold at sunset, a hurricane's outer bands battering a Gulf Coast pier, footage stills of eroding cliffs that looked eerily like our own bluff. I told myself I was just drawing to unwind. I told myself the woman in the sketch, chin propped on her hand, brow furrowed in concentration, lit by screen glow, wasn't necessarily Wren. It was very obviously Wren. I sat cross-legged on the floor near the doorway, sketchbook balanced on my knee, and watched her work for nearly an hour without her noticing. The particular way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she was frustrated with an edit, the way her whole face changed when a clip clicked into place the way she wanted it, lighting up like she'd forgotten anyone else was in the room. I drew the line of her collarbone where the old sweatshirt had slipped sideways. I drew her hands, quick and sure on the keyboard, the same hands that had gripped the front of my shirt 2 nights before like I was the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. She found the sketchbook 2 days later, left open on the kitchen table while I was in the shower, and when I came downstairs she was sitting very still, looking at the page like it had said something out loud. "You draw me like you've been looking at me my whole life," she said. "I have been looking at you my whole life." It came out before I'd decided to say it, and I watched it land, watched something shift behind her eyes. Want and fear, tangled together so completely I couldn't tell where one ended and the other started. She closed the sketchbook gently, like it was something fragile, and slid it back across the table toward me. "Harper." "Don't," I said. "Not yet. I'm not ready for whatever you're about to say to talk me out of this." She didn't argue. She just nodded, and reached across the table, and laced her fingers through mine for exactly 4 seconds before pulling back like she'd remembered a rule she'd made for herself a long time ago. It was that same week that she found the box. I'd left it, foolishly, half shoved under the guest room bed when I moved back in. A shoebox with the lid gone soft at the corners from age, and Wren had gone looking for a spare charging cable and come up with something else entirely. I came into the room to find her sitting cross-legged on the floor, the contents spread out around her like an excavation, sea glass in a dozen shades of green and brown, and one precious cobalt blue, a strip of photo booth pictures from the Boardwalk Arcade 2 towns over. Both of us 14 and gap-toothed and shrieking with laughter in every frame. A pressed beach rose gone the color of old parchment, folded notes in my own looping handwriting that I didn't need to read to remember word for word, and, at the bottom, a careful pencil drawing of the lighthouse, dated the summer we turned 16. She was very quiet when I found her there. "You kept all of this," she said, not looking up. "I told you I kept everything." "I thought you meant, like, sentimentally, in the abstract." Her voice had gone thin. "I didn't think you meant an entire box under your bed for over a decade, Harper. I left. I didn't even say goodbye, and you kept the photo booth strip. You want to know something stupid?" I sat down on the floor across from her, the space between us scattered with a decade of small, precious things. I used to take that box out sometimes, just to prove to myself it had actually happened, that I hadn't invented the entire friendship in my head because I was lonely, because it started to feel that unreal, after a while, like maybe I'd built you up into something you never actually were. "I was never that good," she said quietly. Whatever you built me up into, I promise you I was never that good. I don't think that's true. I picked up the pressed beech rose, careful with its brittleness. I think you were exactly that good. And then you got scared. And scared people do things that don't match who they actually are. She looked up at me then, eyes bright. And for a moment, I thought she might cry again. The way she must have cried the night of the storm after I'd fallen asleep. She didn't. She reached out instead and took the photo booth strip from where it lay between us, studied the two grinning, gap-toothed faces for a long moment. I have a matching one, she admitted, in a storage unit in Denver. I've moved it 4 times in 10 years and never once thrown it away, even when I told myself I should. We didn't kiss that day. We just sat on the floor of the guest room, surrounded by the wreckage of who we used to be to each other, and let 10 years of silence get a little quieter. It almost happened 2 days later, in my studio above the bookstore, of all places. Wren had come to drop off a coffee she claimed was an accident. She'd ordered 2 out of habit and didn't want to waste it. A lie so thin I could see through it before she'd even finished saying it. And she'd stayed, wandering around the small, sunlit room while I worked, trailing her fingers along the spines of reference books, pausing in front of a half-finished cover for a novel about 2 women running a lighthouse together, which felt, we both silently agreed not to comment on, a little too on the nose. You never showed me any of this before, she said, meaning the studio, the work, the whole shape of the life I'd built without her. You never asked. I'm asking now. She turned to face me, leaning back against the paint-splattered work table, close enough that I could smell the salt still clinging to her from the morning shoot she'd done at the point. Tell me about it. All of it. The parts I missed. So, I did. Sketch pencil forgotten in my hand, telling her about Seattle, about the panic attacks that finally sent me home, about the strange, humbling relief of watching my hands remember how to make something just because I wanted to, and not because a deadline demanded it. She listened the way she used to listen when we were kids, completely, like nothing else in the world was happening, and somewhere in the middle of it, she reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and her hand lingered against my jaw, and the space between us went thin and charged the way it had at the lighthouse a decade ago. Harper, she said, low, and I felt my whole body lean toward her before I'd decided to move. Wren? Her name came out rougher than I meant it to. We were close enough that I could count the freckles across her nose, close enough that her breath had gone shallow and quick, and I watched her gaze drop to my mouth, watched her start to close the last few inches between us. Her phone rang, loud and jarring in the quiet studio, and she flinched back like she'd been burned. Dale's name flashed on the screen. She stared at it for a long second before silencing it, but the moment had already scattered, the way moments like that always seem to scatter for us. Some old instinct in her flinching away from the one thing she wanted most, the second it got close enough to actually have. I should take that, she said, not moving. You don't have to. I do, actually. She pushed off the work table, put distance between us that felt deliberate, protective, the same old fear dressed up in a new excuse. It's probably about the meeting. I'll see you at home. She left, and I stood there in the quiet studio with my heart still hammering, paint drying unused on my palette, and thought, not for the first time, that loving Wren Calloway had always been a little bit like standing at the edge of the tide. You could feel it pulling at your feet the whole time, and you never quite knew whether the water was coming in or going out. The town meeting happened that Thursday, in the community hall that still smelled like the potlucks it had hosted since before either of us was born. Folding chairs set up in crooked rows, a coffee urn steaming in the corner that nobody had cleaned since the last emergency meeting during the last big storm season. I watched Wren's spine go rigid the second the man in the expensive jacket started talking, a representative from Meridian Coastal named Beckett who smiled with his mouth and not his eyes, informing the room that the company had already purchased 3 storm-damaged properties along the bluff and was making generous offers on the rest, including, he said, glancing briefly and pointedly toward the back of the room where Wren and I sat, the Calloway property and the old lighthouse land, both of which had been left in a kind of legal limbo since Wren's mother left and her father stopped answering mail. We're simply offering families a dignified exit from properties that are, frankly, becoming liabilities, Beckett said, in the tone of a man who had said the exact same sentence in a dozen other towns. Meridian's development would bring jobs, infrastructure, and long-term stability to this coastline. It would bring an infinity pool where the lighthouse used to be, someone muttered from the third row, and a ripple of grim laughter went through the hall. They're going to bulldoze the lighthouse, Wren said afterward, in the parking lot, voice tight with a fury that had clearly been building for years, aimed at more than just Meridian Coastal. They're going to turn it into some resort with an infinity pool and call it heritage-inspired. The documentary could stop this, Harper. If I show what they're actually doing, the pressure tactics, the lowball offers to people who don't know their rights, the way they're timing this to hit right after storm damage when families are desperate and exhausted and just want someone to make the decision for them, I could stop it. And if you show that, you show my family's house too. My mother's name on those old property records. Everything I've spent 10 years trying not to think about. I would never do that without asking you. You didn't ask me about a lot of things, Wren. It wasn't fair, and I knew it wasn't fair the second it left my mouth. But 10 years of silence doesn't dissolve just because someone climbed through your window during a thunderstorm. She flinched like I'd hit her, and for a second, I thought she might actually walk away, the way she always did when things got too close to the center of her. She didn't. She stood there in the parking lot, with her jaw tight and her eyes bright, and said, "That's fair," which was somehow worse than if she'd fought back. We ate dinner at the diner that night because neither of us wanted to cook, sliding into the same cracked vinyl booth we used to claim as kids, and Marge behind the counter took one look at us and said, "Well, look who's back to being attached at the hip," the way she'd been saying it since we were 9 years old, sliding 2 chocolate milkshakes onto the table without either of us ordering them, muscle memory from a decade ago. You two used to make this whole town dizzy, running around together like a matched set, glad to see some things don't change. Neither of us corrected her, and neither of us looked at each other for a full minute afterward, both suddenly very interested in our milkshakes. Halfway through the meal, the bell over the door jingled, and a woman in a rain-damp coat walked in shaking water off her umbrella. Priya, an old girlfriend of mine from high school, back in town visiting her parents, someone I hadn't seen or thought about in years. She spotted me and lit up, came over to the booth to catch up, all warm hands and easy laughter, and it was perfectly friendly, perfectly harmless, 2 people trading updates about lives that had long since diverged. It was also, apparently, unbearable for Wren. I noticed it in small things, the way her jaw tightened, the way she suddenly became very interested in stirring her milkshake, the too polite smile she offered when Priya said something about how funny it was to see Harper back with her partner in crime. By the time Priya left, promising to catch up properly before she headed back out of town, Wren had gone quiet in a way that felt entirely unlike her. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine. A beat. Old girlfriend?" "High school. It ended amicably. She moved to Portland, I moved to Seattle. We still send each other birthday texts sometimes." I studied her face, the careful neutrality she was working hard to maintain. "Why?" "No reason. Wren." "I don't have a right to be jealous," she said finally, staring hard at the melting ice cream in her glass. "I know that. I left. I don't get to come back 10 years later and mind who else got to have you in the meantime. It's an unattractive, unearned feeling, and I'm aware of that. Thank you." Something in my chest went warm despite myself, some small, petty part of me that hadn't minded at all watching her sit there stewing. For what it's worth, nobody else ever got very much of me. Not really. I think some part of me was always saving the rest for a girl who ran off to chase tornadoes. That's a terrible thing to admit to someone you're mad at. "I never said I wasn't still mad at you," I said, and she laughed, finally, the tension breaking, and reached across the table to steal a fry off my plate, the way she'd done 1,000 times before, and it felt, in that small, ordinary moment, like something was finally beginning to mend. The confrontation with Wren's brother happened 3 days later, when Dale Calloway showed up at my porch uninvited, half-drunk, angry that Wren was stirring up the past with her documentary, angry in the specific, cornered way of a man who'd built a small, safe life out of never examining anything too closely, who'd taken Meridian's early offer on his own strip of land without telling anyone, and clearly didn't want that decision looked at too hard on camera. "You come back here after 10 years and start digging up things people worked hard to bury," he said, jabbing a finger toward Wren, his voice too loud for the quiet evening. "Mom leaving, Dad falling apart. You want to put that on a screen for the whole town to gawk at?" "I want to put the truth on a screen, Dale. There's a difference. The truth doesn't pay anybody's bills. Neither does pretending everything's fine while a corporation buys up our childhood out from under us for pennies," Wren shot back, and something in her voice had gone hard and clear in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Not defensive, not performing, just certain. "I'm not doing this to embarrass anyone. I'm doing it because I'm done being quiet about things that hurt, just because being loud is inconvenient for the people who'd rather I stayed small." Wren stood between us on the porch steps and told him, in a voice I'd never heard her use, steady and low and unafraid, that she wasn't protecting the family's silence anymore, that some things were worth being loud about even when it cost you something. He left, tires spitting gravel down the drive. Wren stood there shaking afterward, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, like she'd finally said a sentence she'd been rehearsing in her head for a decade. "You okay?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "Ask me again in 10 years. I laughed despite myself, and something in her face softened, and that was the night we ended up at the lighthouse again, because some habits really don't die. We went at dusk, ostensibly so she could get footage of the structure, before Meridian's lawyers made access complicated, but we both knew that wasn't really why. Rain was starting again. Not a full storm, just a fine, cold mist that clung to everything. And we stood inside the old tower the way we had a decade ago, water beating on the windows, the beam turning its slow circles above us, the same sound of wind finding the same gaps in the same stone that had listened to 1,000 of our secrets over the years. "I used to think about this exact spot," she said, "more than I probably should have. You left the next morning. I know. You didn't say goodbye. I know, Harper." Her voice cracked on my name. I've never once forgiven myself for that, if it helps. It doesn't, actually. I turned to face her fully, the mist clinging to her eyelashes, her jaw, the same soft curve of her mouth I'd been aching over for half my life. The old anger was rising, the 10-year-old kind, the kind that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. "You left me like I was something you could pack away. Like whatever almost happened here didn't matter enough to explain. I spent a decade thinking I made it up, that I imagined the way you looked at me, because the alternative was that you looked at me like that and left anyway. I didn't leave because I didn't love you." She said it fast, like it had been sitting behind her teeth for years, waiting for the dam to break. "I left because I did. Because that summer, my mother had just gone, my father was falling apart, and I looked at you and I thought, if I let myself have this, if I let myself have you, and then it goes wrong the way everything else in my life was going wrong, I will not survive losing you too. So I left first. I made myself the storm instead of waiting to be caught in one. That's worse, Wren, because I spent 10 years thinking I imagined it, and it turns out I didn't. You just decided alone that I wasn't worth the risk. You were worth every risk there is. That was the whole problem." Her hands came up, not quite touching me, hovering like she didn't trust herself. "I thought loving you would ruin the only good thing I had left, so I burned it down before it could burn on its own. I've spent 10 years photographing disasters, because at least out there, the destruction isn't my fault. Out there, I get to just document the wreckage instead of causing it. You didn't cause a disaster, Wren. You caused an absence. Those aren't the same thing, but they hurt in almost identical ways." Rain was streaking the windows now, harder, and the beam swept over us again, and I could feel us standing at the exact edge of the same cliff we'd stood at 10 years earlier. Except this time, I wasn't 18, and terrified of wanting too much. This time I reached up and put my hand against her jaw, the way she'd once put hers against mine, and she went very still, eyes searching my face like she was waiting to be told to stop. "If you run this time," I said, "I need you to know I won't wait another 10 years. "I'm not running," her voice had gone rough. "I asked you to hold me because I forgot how to ask you to stay. I'm asking now. I'm asking you to let me stay." I kissed her before she could say anything else. It wasn't careful. It wasn't the achingly restrained, tender thing the storm bed had been. It was 10 years of silence breaking all at once, her hands fisting in the front of my jacket, mine sliding into her damp hair, both of us breathing like we'd been holding our breath since we were 18 years old. She made a small sound against my mouth, something between relief and disbelief, and kissed me again, softer this time, like she was trying to memorize it, her thumb tracing along my jaw with a tenderness that made my knees go a little unsteady. The rain kept falling outside, the beam kept turning above us, and none of it mattered half as much as the warmth of her mouth, and the way her whole body seemed to finally exhale against mine, like she'd been holding her breath for a decade too. When we finally broke apart, foreheads pressed together, both of us breathless, she laughed, a real laugh, shaky and bright. 10 years, she said. I have terrible timing. You have the worst timing of anyone I've ever met. Let me be brave when the sky is clear too, she murmured, and I felt that sentence settle somewhere deep in my chest, because I understood exactly what she meant, that she wanted to prove this wasn't just fear finding comfort in an old familiar shape, that she wanted to choose me on the ordinary days as much as the terrifying ones. The weeks that followed were, against every instinct I had, happy. We fell into an easy domestic rhythm that felt both entirely new and achingly familiar. Her coffee order memorized within a day, my habit of falling asleep with a book open on my chest rediscovered and gently teased, a toothbrush that migrated from the guest bathroom to mine without either of us ever officially discussing it. She helped me repaint the porch a soft, faded blue that she swore matched the sea glass in our box. I helped her catalog hours of storm footage, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the sunroom, while she narrated old disasters in a low, focused voice I found embarrassingly attractive, occasionally leaning over to press a kiss to my temple in the middle of describing wind shear, like it was the most natural transition in the world. Some mornings I woke before her and just watched her sleep for a while, the way sunlight fell across her bare shoulder, the small furrow between her brows that never quite smoothed out even in dreams. And I'd think about all the versions of us that never got to exist. The version that kissed at 18 instead of flinching apart. The version that never had 10 years of silence between them. And instead of grief, for the first time, I mostly just felt lucky that this version, the slower, harder one, had found its way to happening at all. She caught me at it once, blinked awake to find me propped on one elbow studying her face, and instead of teasing me the way I expected, she just reached up, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and murmured, half asleep, "You can look as long as you want. I'm not going anywhere." And something in my chest that had been braced for a decade, finally, quietly let go. We drove into the hills one night, chasing a smaller storm just for the thrill of it. Windows down, rain coming in sideways, both of us laughing like teenagers, and she reached over and took my hand on the wet highway and didn't let go until we pulled into a motel outside of town because the roads had gotten too dangerous to keep driving. We spent that night in a room that smelled like old carpet and cheap soap, rain hammering the tin roof, tangled together under a scratchy comforter, trading slow kisses and quiet confessions until the storm outside wore itself out sometime near dawn. She traced idle patterns against my collarbone while she talked, her voice going soft and unguarded in the dark in a way I'd only heard once before, the night she'd crawled through my window soaked and shaking. "I never told you the real reason I'm scared of storms," she said, into the dark, into my shoulder, like it was easier to say it without looking at me. "Everyone assumes it's just leftover nerves from the job. Bad footage day, close call, that kind of thing. It's not. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready. I want to." A long pause, thunder rolling somewhere distant over the hills. The night my mom left, there was a storm. A bad one, worse than the one that brought me to your window. Dad was he wasn't doing well, hadn't been for a long time, and she just packed a bag while it was raining so hard you couldn't hear the car start. I didn't find out until morning. I spent that whole night alone in my room, 12 years old, listening to the thunder, and thinking something was wrong, that something bad was happening. And I was right, except the bad thing wasn't the storm. It was that nobody came to check on me. Dad was too far gone to notice I was scared, and Mom was already gone, and I just lay there by myself for hours convincing myself the noise outside was the reason I couldn't breathe, because that was easier than admitting the real reason. I pulled her closer, pressed my lips to her temple, said nothing, because I understood, finally and completely, why a girl who'd once made me a promise that no storm could scare us if we were together had spent every stormy night after that one, finding her way to somebody's window instead of facing it alone. After that, I got very good at pretending storms didn't bother me, she went on. And then I got very good at running toward the biggest, scariest ones I could find with a camera, because if I was the one choosing to stand in front of the danger, it didn't feel like something happening to me anymore. It felt like something I was doing on purpose. Braver, somehow. Except the night of your storm, the power went out, and for about 90 seconds I was 12 years old again, alone in a dark room, and the only thing I could think was that I needed to get to you before the feeling swallowed me whole. I'm glad you came to me instead of riding it out alone. Me too, she admitted. It scared me almost as much as the storm did, honestly. Needing somebody that badly. I'd spent 10 years building a life where I never needed anybody that badly again. She told me about the tornado in Nebraska too, later, closer to dawn. The one that had put 3 of her colleagues in the hospital and made her question, for the first time in years, whether she was chasing storms or just running from the quiet. Whether the adrenaline had ever really been about the footage at all, or whether some part of her had been daring the sky to finally catch up with her. I told her about the year in Seattle when I stopped painting anything but book covers, because original work felt too much like admitting I wanted something for myself. Like wanting things out loud was a door that led straight back to wanting her. We didn't solve anything that night. We just let each other be known, foreheads touching, breath mingling, her cold feet tucked against my calves the way they always found their way there. And it felt, honestly, like more than solving anything ever could have. One evening, a week or so into all of it, we cooked dinner together for the first time, a chaotic, flour-dusted attempt at her grandmother's biscuit recipe, which she swore she remembered by heart and clearly did not, resulting in a first batch so dense Wren threatened to donate them to Meridian Coastal as a peace offering. We ended up eating scrambled eggs on toast instead, sitting on the kitchen counter with our knees knocking together, and somewhere between bites, she reached over and wiped a smudge of flour off my cheekbone with her thumb, and the gesture was so small and so tender that it undid me more than the kiss at the lighthouse had. I could get used to this, she said, quiet, almost like she was testing the words out loud for the first time to see if they'd hold. The burnt biscuits or the eggs? The whole thing, all of it, this kitchen, you, half asleep at 7 in the morning, yelling at the coffee maker like it personally wronged you. She bumped her shoulder against mine. I spent 10 years living out of duffel bags in a dozen different countries, and I don't think I ever once thought a kitchen counter could feel like the best place I'd ever been. Careful, I said, but I was smiling. That sounds dangerously close to a confession. Maybe it is one. The trouble came the way trouble always came for Wren, in the form of an opportunity too good to easily refuse. A production company wanted to option her documentary and fund a follow-up series, 3 more seasons, filming disappearing coastlines around the world. It meant 18 months, minimum, mostly overseas. She told me about it in the kitchen, standing exactly where she'd stood the morning after the storm, and I watched her try to make the offer sound smaller than it was, watched her hedge and soften and avoid my eyes, and I understood, with a sinking clarity, that some part of her was already halfway out the door, the way she always had been when things got good enough to be worth losing. You don't have to decide right now, I said, carefully, my hands wrapped around my chipped blue mug for something to hold on to. I know, I wanted you to know it exists. Are you going to take it? I don't know, Harper. Because if you're going to leave again, I need you to tell me now, before I let myself keep doing this. My voice was steadier than I felt. I won't be your safe place only when the rest of the world scares you. I can't do that again. I survived it once, and I don't think I have another 10 years in me. I'm not choosing between you and the job like it's that simple. It kind of is that simple, actually. Not the job, the staying. You can take the job and stay in this. Plenty of couples do long distance. I'm not asking you to give up your career for me. I'm asking whether you're capable of leaving without disappearing. Whether you can go somewhere and still be here. I made myself finish it, even though every word cost something. Because the last time you had a hard decision to make, you didn't make it with me. You made it about me, alone, in the dark, and then you left without a word. I need to know if that's still who you are. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that I felt something in my chest start to close. Quietly, protectively, the way it always had whenever I sensed a door about to shut. I need a few days, she finally said. Okay, I said, and I meant it, because I wasn't going to beg. I had spent a decade of my life aching for a woman who left without explanation, and I was not going to spend the next decade aching for a woman who stayed under duress. Take your few days. But Wren, I'm not going to be the place you come back to only when you're breaking. I deserve to be the place you choose on the good days too. She left the kitchen. I heard her bedroom door close, softly, not slammed, which somehow felt worse. I didn't chase her. I went to my studio above the bookstore the next morning, a small, sunlit room with paint-splattered floorboards and a window that looked out over Main Street, the same studio I'd rented since coming home, still half unpacked because some part of me hadn't fully believed I'd stay, and worked through the ache the only way I knew how, hands moving across paper until the shaking in them settled, and I painted, for the first time in years, something that wasn't a commission, the lighthouse beam cutting through rain, and beneath it, two small figures, close together, unafraid. 3 days passed. Marge at the diner told me Wren had been seen driving out to the lighthouse alone every evening, sitting in her car in the parking area for an hour at a time, not going in, just watching the beam turn. I didn't go find her. I'd meant what I said. I wasn't going to be anyone's almost home again, not even hers, not even now, and some small, steady part of me had learned, finally, at 29 years old, how to want someone without needing to chase them to prove it. On the 4th night, the town held its meeting to vote on Meridian Coastal's final offer for the Bluff properties, and the community hall was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it, folding chairs dragged in from the church annex to make room. Wren stood up when they opened the floor to comments, and instead of the documentary she'd been building for months, she played a different reel. 3 minutes of footage she must have shot in secret over the past weeks. Our shoreline at dawn, the lighthouse beam through rain, old-timers on their porches, the diner, the whole imperfect, weathered, beloved shape of the town Meridian wanted to flatten into a brochure. At the end, her own face appeared on screen, unpolished, unguarded, the same way she'd looked the night she crawled into my bed. I spent most of my life running from places, her recorded voice said, because staying anywhere felt like waiting to lose it. I built a career out of chasing storms because at least then the leaving was my choice. But I came back here this year and found out that some things are worth staying in the path of. This film isn't dedicated to a coastline. It's dedicated to the woman who taught me that home isn't a place you survive. It's a person you choose to come back to, storm or no storm. The room went quiet, and then it didn't, a low murmur rising, and by the time the vote happened, the tide had turned entirely. The town voted, nearly unanimous, to reject Meridian's offer and pursue a coastal preservation designation for the bluff instead, lighthouse included, my mother's old house included, all of it protected in a way it hadn't been in years. In the back row, half hidden near the door like he'd only meant to slip in and out unnoticed, sat Wren's father. He hadn't been to a town meeting in years, hadn't been much of anywhere in years, but there he was, hands folded in his lap, watching his daughter's face on the screen with an expression I couldn't quite name. Wren saw him too. I watched something complicated move across her face. Old hurt, old longing, the particular ache of a daughter who'd stopped expecting anything from a parent a long time ago. He found her afterward, out by the coat rack, while the crowd filtered past them toward the parking lot. "That was a good film," he said gruffly, like the words cost him something. "Your mother would have—" He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "I should have come to check on you more, after she left, during those storms. I know I wasn't much good to you those years." "No," Wren agreed, quietly. "You weren't. I'm trying to be better now. It's not much, I know, but I'm trying. Okay, she said. And it wasn't forgiveness. Not fully. Not yet. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut. And when he reached out and squeezed her shoulder once, awkwardly, before shuffling out into the night, I saw something in Wren's shoulders loosen that had probably been tight since she was 12 years old. You okay? I asked, echoing her own question back to her from days before. Ask me again in 10 years, she said, but she was almost smiling, and she reached for my hand without hesitation this time, right there in front of the whole dispersing crowd, and held on. Wren found me outside afterward, under a sky that had finally, mercifully, cleared, stars just starting to prick through overhead. I turned down the job, she said, before I could say anything. Not because I'm scared of it. Because I finally figured out I don't want to be brave by running toward disasters anymore. I want to be brave here, with you, on the ordinary days, when nothing is falling apart and there's no excuse to need somebody, except that I just do. Wren, I'm not asking you to be my shelter, she said. I already have shelter. I have a house full of sea glass, and a woman who kept every scrap of us for 10 years, even when she thought it was pointless. I don't need somewhere to hide from the storm anymore, Harper. I want somebody to stand beside me after it passes. That's you. It's always been you. I didn't answer with words. I closed the distance and kissed her, right there in the parking lot, in front of half the town filing out of the community hall behind us, and she laughed against my mouth, and somewhere behind us I heard Marge say something about it being about time, and neither of us cared even a little. Weeks later, the first real storm of the new season rolled in off the water, thunderheads stacking up along the horizon all afternoon, while we cleared the porch furniture together, an easy, practiced rhythm now, no awkwardness left in it at all. That night I lay in bed listening to the thunder build the way I always had, and I heard my bedroom door open, not with fear this time, not with the frantic, soaked urgency of that first night, but slow, easy, a little amused at herself. You don't have to sneak in the window anymore, I said, without opening my eyes. Old habits, Wren said, and I felt the mattress dip as she climbed in beside me, dry this time, warm, smelling like the ordinary soap in our ordinary bathroom instead of rain and desperation. She curled against my side and pressed a kiss to my shoulder, unhurried. I just like an excuse to hold you. You don't need an excuse. I know. Thunder rolled outside, distant now, already passing over the water toward some other coastline, some other set of windows. I just like doing it anyway. I turned in her arms until we were facing each other, the lighthouse beam sweeping faint light across the ceiling the way it had every stormy night of both our childhoods, patient and constant, and she smiled at me in the dark, unguarded, entirely unafraid, and I understood, finally, all the way down to the bones of it, that we weren't hiding from anything anymore. We were just two women who had found their way back to each other, holding on through the last of the thunder, waiting together, easily, happily, for the quiet on the other side, with no need to brace for what came after, because we already knew. What came after was this. What came after was each other, storm or no storm, for as long as either of us wanted to stay, which, as it turned out, was for a very long time. The lighthouse still stands today, repainted, its lens restored by a small grant, the preservation designation made possible, and on clear evenings you can find tourists climbing the same worn steps Wren and I climbed 1,000 times as girls, taking photographs of a view we used to think belonged only to us. My mother's beach house still stands too, porch freshly blue, the shutter that used to bang in every storm finally repaired properly, instead of just patched. We kept the box of sea glass and photo booth strips and pressed flowers, added to it over the years, a ticket stub from the night Wren's documentary premiered at a small theater 2 towns over, a receipt from the diner with Marge's handwriting scrawled across the back wishing us well, a hotel key card from the motel where a smaller storm once stranded us somewhere we needed to be stranded. Wren still travels for work sometimes, chasing weather across the country a few weeks at a time, and I still catch myself, some nights, standing at the window watching the sky for the particular color that means a storm is coming. But the fear is different now, threadbare and mostly gone. worn down by years of watching her walk back through the front door, instead of disappearing through it. Sunburned, wind-burned, exhausted, grinning, dropping her camera bags in the hallway, and finding me wherever I happen to be in the house. Like coming home to me has become its own kind of instinct, the way running away from things once was. Sometimes, on stormy nights when she's away, I sleep with the window cracked open anyway, just a little, out of habit, out of 10 years of memory that finally stopped hurting to hold on to. And on the nights she's home, we don't need the window at all. She just walks through the front door, shakes the rain from her hair, and finds her way into my arms the ordinary way, the easy way. No thunder required, though every so often when the sky does decide to split itself open above the coast, she still climbs into bed beside me with a small, private smile, presses herself against my side and says, just to hear herself say it, just because she can, "Hold me anyway." I always do.